It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. John Wiersema. John was with the USDA's Agricultural Research Service, ARS, for more than 30 years. He now serves as a research associate in the Botany Department at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. And for those of you who may not know, we are a Smithsonian affiliate at Selby Gardens. And so each year we always try to invite one of our science colleagues from the Smithsonian to do a presentation. And the last few years, we've been inviting botanists to talk about the plant families that are featured in our exhibition program. So we give them a little challenge to do a sort of artsy talk, which might be a little bit different than some of the talks that they typically would do. And I think you'll agree that John's done a great job after you see this talk, where you'll learn an awful lot about the scientific side of water lilies, but you'll also learn about Claude Monet's kind of basically obsession with water lilies and his experimentation and how that led to some of his most well-known paintings. Dr. Wiersema is a specialist on the taxonomy of the water lily group, focuses his research on the water lily genus Nymphaea. He studied and collected these plants in both temperate and tropical countries on 6 continents, personally cultivating at least 60 such gatherings for direct observation over the last 4 decades. And you'll see some pictures of his own garden and cultivation. I think it's really fascinating. He's discovered and described several new species and has participated in over 30 publications on the group. So he is definitely what we would call an expert in water lilies. This talk is going to examine the role water lilies play in the aquatic landscape, explore the relationships among the various forms of water lilies throughout the world, and probe the aesthetic qualities that have made them the ultimate aquatic ornamental. We'll also investigate the early history of water lily hybridization in Europe in relation to the water lilies available to Monet when he established his water garden at Giverny in the late 19th century, with a closer look at those that successfully established on his estate. And by the way, I've never been to Giverny. I don't know if many people on this call have been, but I understand that it took Claude Monet about 17 years to design his garden and really get it to just exactly what he wanted it to be. So finally, an appreciation of the sheer beauty and serenity of both a pristine water lily setting and a Monet impressionistic rendering of it. So you'll get to see some great side-by-side comparisons of Monet's beautiful paintings and also this incredible plant. So I also would like to contextualize this talk within our current exhibition. And for those of you who haven't seen it, and I think most people on this call have, but for those of you who haven't, it is called Roy Lichtenstein, Monet's Garden Goes Pop. And it's a really wonderful exhibition. It's being very well received by our guests. And I'm going to show you a little 1-minute video so you can see what it looks like if you haven't been here. And I want you to pay a especially close attention to our water lilies that you're going to see in this. see in that video, and again, if you haven't been here, I really encourage you to, Roy Lichtenstein did his own interpretation of Claude Monet's famous water lilies and haystacks. And they were a subject that Monet just really enjoyed painting, especially the water lilies in his latter years. So I just wanted to mention that today's program will be recorded and shared afterwards. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wiersema. And again, thank you for being with us today. And at the end, as I mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A, which you can put into the chat or the Q&A feature of Zoom.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie, and welcome from the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia. As she has indicated, I am a plant taxonomist, and I'm going to talk to you about water lilies in relation to the French Impressionist Claude Monet. To summarize the content of my talk, first a little about my background, which explains why I'm giving this talk. Then something about the ecology of water lilies in the landscape. A little bit about the evolution of this group in relation to other angiosperms and within the group. Something of the classification of the order, the family, and the genus of water lilies. And then shifting into discussions of Monet's water gardens, where he got his water lilies for those gardens, and some evolution, what you see in the evolving of Monet's water lily paintings over the years. And then closing with some views from actual water lilies in natural settings around the world. Although I grew up with some appreciation for water lilies in rural Michigan, my graduate studies, shown here, of the genus and family of this group necessarily focused my attention on them in the beginning. While I had other responsibilities during my USDA career, I sustained this interest in water lilies in the intervening years in several different ways. One way has been by writing taxonomic treatments of the group for various flora projects, as shown here. Another is through continued field work to various parts of the world. As you can see, there are difficulties one must overcome to collect many of these species in the multitude of places one finds them in nature. In this case, I'm actually digging it up with my feet, so I don't have to go underwater to get this plant in Canada. And in this case, we had just come from a lake that I later found out contained schistosomes. So I was very glad I used rubber gloves and hip waders to make these collections here. Another activity that's maintained my interest in water lilies is through their cultivation. Over the last 4 decades, I've had in cultivation at least 42 of the 56 species shown in bold here, which is 75% of them. I started growing them in 1982. The image of the right actually was part of my backyard, where these are some of the 49 different containers I had buried in various places in the yard to grow them separately and keep the species pure as best I could. In addition to the contributed flora treatments on the water lily family that I already mentioned, some 35 of my other scientific publications have involved water lilies and their relatives. A few are indicated here. The publications in the left column have resulted from more recent collaborations with other botanists doing molecular DNA research. This has greatly expanded our understanding of the relationship among this group of plants. The water lily genus Nymphaea is entirely aquatic, inhabiting mainly fresh open water of lakes, ponds, lagoons, swamps, marshes, slow-moving streams of rivers and spring pools, or in some cases, even brackish tidal flats as seen here below. In lakes or ponds, the leaves float on the water to a few meters deep, which is too deep for the emergent vegetation and effectively shades out the submerged plants, pushing them out into deeper water. So they have this niche all to themselves. And being rooted, they can outcompete these free-floating plants, which require more nutrients in order to thrive. But the water lilies can get these nutrients from the soil. You see here a list of specialized adaptations that allowed them to thrive in this ecological niche. I'm not going to read through this list. Hopefully you've had a chance to look it over while this slide was on. There are some other genera that have more than a single species that compete with water lilies for this same rooted, floating-leaved aquatic niche. One of these is the related genus Nymphaea, which has 8 species confined to north temperate areas, otherwise known as cow lily, yellow spatterdock, or yellow pond lily, or spatterdock. It's found here in Florida there. Another is the genus Nymphaeaces, otherwise known as floating heart, around 50, but mostly tropical species. Another is the water lotus, the lumbo. There are 2 species, one in Eastern and Southern Asia down to Australia, another one here in mostly Southeastern North America, where it's sometimes known as water chinkapin. It has yellow flowers in contrast to this one. And there's the genus Nymphaea with some 60 tropical and temperate species. This is the water lilies we'll be talking about primarily today. By both number of species and its extensive distributional range, water lilies have been the most successful among these genera at filling this niche. The exploitation of this ecological niche goes back to the time of the dinosaurs, really, in the late Cretaceous. This evolutionary tree shows the most recent classification of flowering plants, the angiosperms. Note at the top right, the second highlighted branch, the Nymphaeales. This is one of the earliest offshoots of the tree of the angiosperms. And this lineage gave rise to 2 of those genera I just showed you, Nymphaea and Nymphaea, and some others which I'll talk about momentarily. The other 2 floating plant genera fall into distinct orders further down the evolutionary tree of angiosperms, also highlighted here. There are 3 distinct families currently recognized in the water lily order. The estimated ages in millions of years ago of the nodes where the various groups became separate lineages are indicated on this slide. The Hydatylaceae, a small family of 12 species, diverged very early from the rest of the group. The 2 shaded orders shown here indicate relationships that are somewhat uncertain at this point. The status of Nymphaea vis-a-vis the Cobambaceae, a small family of 7 species, and the Nymphaeaceae, a larger family of 65 species, remains contentious, as the next slide will illustrate. So too does the relationship of Victoria, the Amazon water lily, and Murals to Nymphaea. And this is currently being studied using chloroplast DNA. Preliminary evidence, which is not yet published, suggests the age of this family and genus may be some 50 million years older than previously assumed here. As noted, the water lily order comprises 3 families and 8 genera, all of these aquatic. The Hydatulaceae with a single genus occurs primarily in Australia. This is the genus. The Kabambaceae has 2 genera, Kabamba, otherwise known as fanwort, in the Americas, and Brassinia, the water shield, which is widespread. The Nymphaeaceae currently have 5 genera, Barclaya in tropical Indo-Malaysia, Victoria in tropical America, Euryale in Eastern and Southern Asia, Nuphar in North Temperate regions, and Nymphaea widespread. As illustrated here, the most recent molecular studies are equivocal in the placement of Nuphar, placing it either with either genera of the Nymphaeaceae, with Kabambaceae, or perhaps in a family of its own here. The most complete work to date on the classification of the water lily genus, Nymphaea, is Henry Conard's 1905 monograph based on his doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania. Conard drew heavily on the earlier work of the French botanist Jules-Émile Planchon and the German botanist Robert Caspary in arriving at his classification. He divided the genus into 2 groups, the Apocarpii containing 2 subgenera, and the Syncarpii containing 3 subgenera. All 5 of these groups continue to be supported in current molecular research. A generalized water lily flower you can see here. It's said to be complete in having all 4 whorls of flower parts, the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels. It's also perfect in having both the pollen-bearing parts, the stamens, and the ovule and seed-bearing carpels, which form the ovary, in the same flower. There are always 4 greenish sepals, several to numerous petals of varying colors, numerous stamens, mostly yellowish tinted, and several to many united carpels with terminal appendages, these small tongue-shaped structures shown here. As already mentioned, the genus can be divided into 2 groups. This is based on whether the lateral walls of the carpels are fused, as you can see here, or whether they're separate. Syncarpus in this case, Apocarpus in this case. Although subgenus Nymphaea, which was called Castalia, by the way, in Conard's classification, has the carpels completely fused and is thus syncarpus, molecular evidence indicates that it actually forms a branch apart from the other subgenera, the earliest branch in the water lily genus. The other 4 genera form 2 groups, as seen here and here. Subgenus Nymphaea actually resembles the Apocarpus group in being day-flowering, having pollen sacs arranged laterally on the anthers, which are part of this part of the stamen, and less developed carpellary appendages compared to the ones you see here. Now I'll provide a summary of each of the 5 subgenera, starting with the apocarpous and diurnally flowering subgenus Anecphyo. This is confined to the tropics of Australia and New Guinea and has 16 currently recognized species. These have many, many slender stamens and no appendages on the carpels at all. The flower color ranges from white to varying shades of blue or violet. The leaves of this subgenus can be either smooth margined, which we would call entire, or toothed, which we would call dentate. Note that the flowers are strongly elevated above the water surface in all cases here. An unusual member of this group from Northwest Australia, the Kimberley region, was once considered a distinct genus, Untitled, because of its completely submerged habit and its strange flowers with few flower parts and this protruding central axis, not seen in the other subgenera. Molecular evidence, however, which you see here, clearly shows it to be deeply embedded within this whole clade here, which consists of all of the species of Anecphyo that were sampled, being closely related to another species, Nymphaea hastifolia. Excuse me for that. It does produce floating leaves at times, although these are rarely seen. The other apocarpous and day-flowering subgenus, Brachyceras, contains 17 species and is found in both the Old and the New World tropics. The stamens are more rigid in this subgenus, usually with prominent terminal appendages. Here in this species, they're bluish. And the carpels have short tongue-like appendages. The flower color here also ranges from white to bluish or violet, although there are 2 yellow-flowered species isolated in South Central Africa, one of them shown here. Both Nymphaea elegans and Nymphaea ampla occur in southern Florida. Ampla quite rarely, only in Lee County. The smooth margins on the leaves of this subgenus, or the leaf margins in this subgenus, range from smooth or entire, in this case, to strongly toothed or dentate. And the flowers are usually elevated above the water surface, as in the previous subgenus Anecphyo. The syncarpous subgenus Hydrocalyx, the one I actually did my dissertation on, is entirely night blooming. The leaves are always smooth margin, except in this one species, Nymphaea rugiana. And they're mostly submerged in this unusual Nymphaea oxypetala. There are 15 species. They're all in the New World tropics. One of them, Nymphaea jamesoniana, gets into southern Florida. Here you can see the well-developed carpellary appendages in this subgenus. Most of them quite intensely colored. In some species, at least, these play a role in heat generation and as a food source for pollinating scarab beetles that get trapped in their nocturnal flowers during the day. The flowers are strongly aromatic to attract the pollinating beetles. The flowers of Nymphaea oxypetala are quite unusual in having very striking, very pointed or sharply pointed or acuminate petals. The other night blooming and Syncarpus subgenus Lotos is confined to the Old World tropics. However, Nymphaea lotus is sparingly naturalized in the neotropics, including in Lee County, Florida. The flowers of this group range from white to deep red in some Nymphaea rubra, with the leaves sharply dentate in all species. Although opening at night, they remain open through the following morning, closing by noon. The stamens are very rigid and remain erect when the flowers are open and the petals have fully spread. Some populations of Nymphaea rubra are said to be sterile, others fertile. So the status of this as an independent species is questionable. And the placement of the blue-flowered Nymphaea petersiana, which otherwise resembles African members of subgenus Brachyceras, seems quite anomalous, but this is based on molecular analyses. The placement here from these studies may suggest that this species arose via natural hybridization with that other subgenus, something that needs further exploration. And finally, there's the north temperate Syncarpus subgenus Nymphaea, which includes the Eurasian Nymphaea alba, the type of the genus, which is why this subgenus is called Nymphaea. Here, the carpellary appendages are mainly short and tongue-shaped. The petals mainly white in color, although they're yellow in Nymphaea mexicana. This species and Nymphaea odorata both occur naturally in Florida. There are pink or reddish forms of both the European Nymphaea alba and our North American Nymphaea odorata. At least two such forms may exist in North America. This is one. The other, not shown, was first discovered in New England on Cape Cod. It is this subgenus, including these forms, that is of paramount importance in understanding the water lilies of Monet, to which we will now turn our attention. The story of Monet's water gardens began in 1883 with his move to the village of Giverny, some 50 miles by rail west-northwest of Paris. 7 years later, he was able to buy the property where he had resided and began to develop his water gardens. He purchased some land across the road to develop a pond in 1893 and constructed the first Japanese bridge in 1895, as shown in the upper left photo. He had placed his first water lily order in 1894, so that you can see a few plants are starting to grow in the 1895 photo, but substantially more you will see by the turn of the century. The aquatic gardens were enlarged with the diversion of a nearby stream in 1901 and purchase of some adjacent land. And he ordered additional water lilies for his gardens in 1900 and 1904. Although he would have had access to populations of the native European white water lily, Nymphaea alba, which dotted the French landscape, the source of most of Monet's water lilies in his ponds was the nursery of Joseph Bory Latour-Marliac in southern France. In 1889, Latour-Marliac exhibited his hybrid water lilies at the World's Fair in Paris, where he won a first prize in their category, and they caught Monet's attention. Both Giverny and the nursery of Latour-Marliac have climatic conditions comparable to hardiness zone 8, which covers much of the southeastern United States. This is fine for temperate species, but not so for tropical ones. Monet's initial 1894 order from Latour-Marliac, seen here, included 3 water lilies. One was the yellow-flowered Nymphaea mexicana, at that time known as Nymphaea flava, which originated from Florida, actually. There were also 2 hybrids, one with pinkish and one with light yellow flowers. Interestingly, this was followed by 5 plants of the genus Nelumbo, the water lotuses I showed you earlier, for which Latour-Marliac had added detailed instructions on their cultivation. There's some uncertainty about the origin of the red coloration in the red-flowered water lilies produced by Latour-Marliac and grown by Monet. From the previous slide surveying the genus, you would have noticed pinkish or reddish coloration in flowers of Nymphaea rubra of the tropical subgenus Lotus, and in some forms of the hardy Nymphaea alba from Sweden and Nymphaea odorata from New England of subgenus Nymphaea. The article on the left suggests the reddish color comes from the Swedish plant shown in the photo here. However, comments by Latour-Marliac in the article on the right indicates his initial dissatisfaction right here with the Swedish form because it didn't produce enough flowers, and his subsequent reliance in his breeding on the Cape Cod form from North America. You see, I gave all my attention to the fascinating American species, at least in his initial breeding work. So which one was it? The Swedish or the American plant that furnished the red color of Monet's water lilies? Latour-Marliac went on in the 1893 article to imply that sometime after the Paris exhibition, he was able to produce a red-flowered form by crossing a tropical and temperate hybrid that had the color of the tropical Nymphaea rubra. This was capable of yielding seed, from which he was then able to cross selected progeny with other forms that were capable of vegetative propagation, and he could eventually get red-flowered plants that he could propagate and sell. And he mentioned one of these under the name Nymphaea ledekeri rosea, which you might remember was one of the 3 water lilies, the pink one, in Monet's first order. But Conard, in his 1905 monograph, mentions the uncertainty about Marliac's hybrids. In particular, he doubted the veracity of the suggestion that Marliac or anyone else could have made a successful cross between a tropical water lily, in this case subgenus Lotus, and a hardy water lily of subgenus Nymphaea. And in fact, Conard included a section on cultivated water lilies toward the end of his monograph. And in it, he treated the red-flowered introductions from Marliac in 2 of the entries, number 13, number 17. Several of these had been described and illustrated by Edouard François André in the French horticultural journal Revue Horticole in 1895. where this plate was published, and the statement made by Andre indicating that coming from Marliac, that Nymphaea ruber had been directly crossed with the hardy water lilies of Europe and North America. However, Conard in his treatment indicates, although tentatively, his belief that the Swedish Nymphaea alba rubra was actually the plant that Marliac used to arrive at these red-flowered variant hardy water lilies. Within a few years of receiving his first water lilies from Latour-Marliac in 1894, Monet had begun to paint them. While he's said to have begun painting them already in 1895, it was not until 1897 that these were first shown to a visiting reporter, though not yet the public. The first water lily paintings, as shown here, focus primarily on individual plants. We know that Monet did not have a tropical water lily with blue flowers, all of which have their flowers exerted above the water. So he obviously took some artistic license in depicting the one on the right. Shortly thereafter, he began to paint his water lilies in association with the Japanese bridge that he built over his pond in 1895. For 2 years, the bridge featured in every one of his water lily paintings, but under varying light conditions. At this time, though he included the bridge in a few 1905 paintings, it's not evident in any painting until after World War I in 1918. And then it's mostly rendered in dark, somber tones, probably reflecting the post-war sentiment of that time, and in a much more impressionistic style, being barely visible in most works, perhaps the result of his worsening vision brought on by the cataracts first diagnosed in 1912. In both 1900 and 1904, Monet ordered additional water lilies from Latour-Marliac. I could not find out what was in the 1900 order, but I did find this quote that suggested that it may have partly consisted of blue-flowered tropical forms that he tried unsuccessfully to grow in Giverny because they require much more heat than the hardy temperate ones. By that time, he employed several gardeners to assist in keeping his aquatic gardens in immaculate condition, which probably included fertilizing them and regular removal of the spent leaves and flowers. We do know that in 1904, he ordered only the 4 reddish flowered plants illustrated here. So he seems to have had some infatuation with the red ones. In 1902, Monet began a series of paintings focusing exclusively on water lilies. Here, there is still some inclusion of the bank vegetation on the horizon in these paintings. This would disappear in most later paintings as the focus gradually shifted from the water lilies themselves to surface reflections of the sky, clouds, and background vegetation. He would ultimately leave some 250 water lily paintings to posterity. As well as the water lily murals, he began painting in 1914. In his paintings from this year, it is obvious that the vantage point of his pond is nearly the same in each one. One can make out the same clusters of plants in the same arrangement on the water surface. Changes in lighting and the reflections on the water surface are increasingly detailed and dominating the canvas, although one can still clearly make out the Nymphaeas. And the next year, although we still have numerous paintings from the same vantage point, Both the water lilies and the reflections on the water surface are becoming less distinct and more impressionistic. In the following year, 1907, many of his water lily paintings still have a common vantage point, but now they have a central theme focused on variations of the intense skylighting reflecting from the water surface. The water lilies, while still evident, seem to assume a secondary role. It's been noted that he likely worked on several canvases at the same time, waiting for just the right lighting to resume each one. And this seems readily apparent from these paintings. His 1908 paintings display far more variation in orientation than those of previous years. Some have fairly distinct portrayals of the Nymphaeas, while others have a very impressionistic portrayal. For the first time now, we can clearly make out the deep red water lilies he had purchased 4 years earlier and was now successfully and no doubt proudly growing. Likely for personal reasons, culminating in the death of his wife in 1911 and his deteriorating vision, Monet took a 3 to 4 year hiatus from his water lily painting. However, he did spend some time and effort enlarging his water lily pond during that time. But when he resumed these paintings, his style had obviously evolved, as you can see here. In many paintings, the plants are now rendered far more distinctly. Monet's deteriorating vision is now becoming increasingly apparent in his paintings by this post-war time, after World War I. Here we have one of his somber renderings of the Japanese bridge that had dominated his paintings 2 decades earlier. There's far less detail in his paintings now. The style evident in the paintings from this year, 1919, most certainly was impacted by his very poor vision. It would be 4 more years before his eyes were operated on to remove his cataracts with some success, although limited. There is no consistent vantage point, as he's probably painting mostly from memory in his studio. Over the last decade of his life, much of his work was accomplished in his studio, mostly from memory of the water lily scenes he had painted for well over 2 decades. After much wrangling from 1920 to 1922 over the design and construction of the building to house his water lily murals, a contract was finally in place for their donation to the French state for placement in the Orangerie in Paris. And they finally arrived there in 1927, the year after Monet's death at the age of 86. Despite his failing health and vision, he had continually revised them nearly to the end. While Monet left an amazing legacy of water lily paintings, his elaborate Giverny estate and gardens continue to attract about 500,000 visitors each year since being restored and reopened to the public in 1978. The artistry of his gardening, which furnished the inspiration for his artwork, is still apparent there. By coincidence, actually, today is the day of reopening of the gardens following its closure due to the pandemic. I was fortunate enough to visit here back in 2002 and anticipate returning there later this year. While Monet created his own natural-looking water lily garden to inspire his paintings, because the genus Nymphaea is distributed on every continent except Antarctica, with few exceptions, one can find in surrounding lakes and ponds throughout the world beautifully serene vistas like this one. This is Nymphaea odorata, the fragrant water lily, in Michigan, my home state, as I noted. This species occurs throughout eastern North America, as well as Florida. And this is Nymphaea mexicana, the banana or yellow water lily, and the one ordered by Monet in his initial order from Latour-Marliac. In the United States, this species is confined to the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, from North Carolina to Texas. Curiously, although one can readily see the elevation of the flowers above the water surface in this species, Monet never painted yellow flowering specimens that way, nor did he elevate the leaf pads above the surface for any species. Careful spacing to prevent overcrowding would have been necessary in his garden to avoid this. And this may be why he abandoned his supposedly failed cultivation of water lotuses, which mostly have emergent leaves and flowers, which would have obscured the reflections from the water surface, which became an integral and important part of his paintings. Here is an example from South America of the only native day blooming species there. And here is one of its close tropical relatives from Central America. Actually, the two of these were at one time considered a single species, but we've shown them to be distinct. Such a setting as this one with its shadows and reflections might well have inspired Monet. Monet could have taken inspiration as well from the water lilies and reflections in this pristine setting. This otherwise African species, which is the Egyptian lotus featured in the hieroglyphs, is occasionally naturalized in the neotropics. And here we find a related species, the Cape blue water lily in Africa. Some have united this species with the previous one, as well as some others, but this is clearly a taxonomic oversimplification. And how can one argue with the magnificent splendor of this population of red-flowered water lilies in Thailand? It's not clear if this species is native there, as it's easy to see why it would be introduced outside its natural range. As I could mention, it's not even certain that this is a true breeding species, as some populations are said to be fertile, others sterile. As I indicated already, this is the one Latour-Marliac claimed to have hybridized with a hardy water lily to give his red flowered hybrids. And finally, to top off our water lily journey, a few splendid images of the impressive tropical Australian water lilies, which Monet never succeeded in cultivating. In closing, I leave you with this stunning, gigantic Australian species, so aptly named. It is one of the two Australian species that had been discovered by Monet's time and could well have been in the possession of Latour-Marliac. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was fascinating.
You're welcome.
Really very interesting. Thank you so much. Well, folks, we're glad that you attended, and we have a couple questions coming in here. So, John, I'll start with our two Q&A questions. This one's from Marilyn Shelley. Hi, Marilyn. We have attempted to add water lilies to the lake in our Sarasota neighborhood with little success. Is there a best time of year to introduce these plants? One of our neighbors suggested that water birds were eating them. Is that a possibility?
I have seen water birds eat the fruits of water lilies. I've not necessarily seen them go after the tubers. So I don't know about that. as far as planting them, is this a situation with permanent water? It's not a seasonal.
My guess is yes. Marilyn, I think I
And it
can't
also
tell.
depends on what one is
You
growing.
said yes. Mm-hmm.
The tropical ones are generally adapted to a drought, rainy season cycle. So they're dormant during the dry time, and most of their habitats can become completely dry. Whereas in the rainy season, they will be covered with water.
Mm-hmm.
So something could be dormant when you're planting it. You know, there has to be enough water there, but these things may expect to go dormant, expect a dry season when they're not getting it. So what I do, which works well in more temperate places, is take them out of the water and store them over the winter, just as the tubers. But there are temperate species, but the temperate species, such as Nymphaea odorata, are Eastern North American plant. Inhabits areas all the way up to Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so well adapted to Florida,
Mm-hmm.
and it may not like all the heat there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Chimed in and said she doesn't know what variety was planted, so that I'm certain would weigh into
so,
it.
I mean,
Mhm.
you're kind of in the middle there. You can try temperate or tropical, but they each have kind of their own conditions that they're going to like.
Mhm.
I would have to know more about the specific situation to try to give advice on that. It would be great if you could grow the yellow flowered Nymphaea mexicana,
Mhm.
which does grow in that area. I collected it some 3 or 4 decades ago in the Mayaca River.
Hmm.
I assume it's still there, but yeah, it was first described from Florida as Nymphaea
Interesting.
flava.
And Marilyn, maybe you can ask the horticulture team what water lilies they're using right now for the exhibition, because they're doing quite well in our water features. And that's not something that we typically have on display. So, um, and then we have another question here. Can you tell us where the picture you shared from Michigan was taken? You must have another Michiganer on the phone.
I don't know where, let's see. The one of the population of Nymphaea odorata.
I think so. That's the one that's coming to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, this plant is widespread in Michigan. I know the botanist who took it, and I know that he has taken a bunch of pictures around the Grand Rapids area in
Mhm.
more recent times. I think maybe he's even moved to that area. So it's possible that it came from there,
Uh-huh.
but pretty much anywhere in the state of Michigan, you can find this thing
Mhm.
in small ponds, marshes, whatever, where there's open water.
Great. Very cool. Um, let's see, we're getting a couple more questions here. Let's see, first a compliment. Thank you so much. This presentation perfectly combined my love of science and art and nature. That's great. That's always our hope. And Jim Payone, one of our volunteers, said hopefully with the expansion and renovation of the gardens, a water lily pond will be included. And yes, in fact, we are going to have a beautiful water lily garden in front of our new Welcome Center. So John, you'll have to come down and check that out. Marilyn chimed in and said many homeowners employ companies to kill all aquatic plants. That's true. We have some interesting landscape practices here in Florida with HOAs and all of our developed neighborhoods.
Yeah, the community where I live had a nice stand of lotus in the reservoir, but it's gone now. They killed it off last year.
It's too bad.
I was disappointed to see that.
Yeah, that is really too bad. Susan Burke asked, how large do the pads grow?
Well, if you're getting to Victoria, which evidence is increasingly showing is actually a Nymphaea. They can be over 6 feet in diameter. As far as Nymphaea, I've seen them almost approaching 3 feet in diameter. In one place in Guyana, I was amazed. I thought it was something completely different than what I had encountered before. And it was in water that was over my head. So I had to find someone with a boat to get out there, which I was finally able to do. And when I got out there, I found it was the same thing as something else that otherwise has leaves just several inches in diameter. But it was thriving, and it was a really remarkable population.
Do you think it just had a lot more sun exposure or something with the water quality?
Well, I mentioned that these tropical, especially this is in the subgenus Hydrocalyx, that these tropical ones are adapted to mostly to a drought, rainy season cycle. But this one is not so well adapted. So whereas you can have a population, and I've seen them with as many as 5 different species there, it gradually dries up, and it may be a little bit of water left in the middle. And that's where you'll find this one getting through the dry season. So it doesn't like to get completely dried out. And then when the water comes back, it's in the very middle. It's got exactly what it wants. It may be several feet of water, but it can thrive there. Whereas the other ones are around the periphery. They like shallower water.
Interesting.
There are actually there's one interesting species that grows in rivers, and it comes out as the water levels rise, and it can be in 15 or more feet of water.
Wow.
The leaves,
strange conditions for them to grow in.
the leaves gradually elongate, and the flowers to get to the surface. All the other species grow as the water's receding, they come out, but this one comes out as the water is rising and follows the water on up.
And it roots in the ground in the river?
Yes. You go there in the dry season and there's nothing there. But I was told where this plant had been in the rainy season, in an area you just simply can't get to at that time of year. And I dug in the mud or in the dirt, and there were the tubers.
Interesting. It seems like studying aquatics is a little bit like studying epiphytes, like we do here at Selby. It's a very unique niche as far as how they grow and where they grow. I'm curious on a personal level, how you became interested in water lilies.
Well, I mean, I'd been around them to some extent when I grew up, but when I actually went to graduate school, I had already by then decided I was going to go into botany, although I'd never had a botany class. I'd had a class in every other aspect of biology. And so I went around the department, and the plant taxonomist who was there happened to be a specialist on aquatic plants. And he suggested a study that one of his colleagues had done in New England, going around and getting water samples and trying to sort out the distribution of the aquatics in relation to the water chemistry. So I agreed to do a study like that, and I needed a plant I could actually easily find driving around the state of Alabama. So I picked the water lily family. And indeed, I was able to find about 50 different populations of Nymphaea in the state and take these samples. That amounted to my master's thesis. So from there, I I decided to keep working on the genus, and there was this group of tropical American night blooming species that nobody really had worked on since Conard in 1905. And so it was ripe for study. And as it turned out, there were 5 undescribed species in that group. And in all, 15 species now. So I spent my time in the neotropics, collecting these things and studying them in the laboratory as well. But as you see, I've continued this interest up to the present time.
That's great. I really enjoyed the pictures of your garden at home where you're experimenting with.
Well, I sold that house, and now I'm moving them to Northern Virginia. So it's a bit of work to get them reestablished here. But when I moved from Alabama to Maryland, that was quite an undertaking as well. Then I had them in these number 3 galvanized wash tubs. I had like 25 of those in my backyard in Alabama.
That's neat. We're getting another question here from Linda Martin. She asked, are water lilies considered an invasive plant?
It depends what your perspective is. Mine would be no, but there are places where, they're considered as such, mainly because, well, in reservoirs, which are lakes produced by, or bodies of water produced by damming up some water course, they often don't want vegetation covering the entire thing. It can have impacts on boating, on fishing, and so on that they want to avoid. And if the water's not deep enough, if it's up to, say, 2 meters deep, these floating plants can take over the entire surface. Now, they can be very attractive there, but if your interest is in fishing or boating or something, that may not be your preference. So yeah, in some situations, it's going to depend on, what is the actual habitat and how deep is the water and so on.
It makes me think a little bit about Monet's garden, and if he, really curated it, if he.
Oh, he extensively curated it.
Sorry, let me go back. I mean, I know that he did that, but what I mean by that is, he really loved the reflective quality of the water, and so many of his paintings were looking at the water was like looking at the sky. And I wonder if the water lilies at some point, became invasive, and he had to sort of pluck them out and create more space in between them. I just, I wonder if.
Well, I've seen it reported that at least now the water lilies there are not, they're all contained in pots.
Okay.
The tubers, so they cannot spread outside of a certain area.
Yeah.
And if you look at his paintings, that's pretty much what you see. They're little clusters of
They're
leaves.
Controlled, maybe.
Single plants, separated. So I think that was intentional and probably advised by Latour-Marliac to do it that way.
Yeah. Because,
for instance, the Nymphaea mexicana, the one from the yellow-flowered one from Florida, can be very aggressive, particularly the hybrids of that, because it produces these stolons that the thing can spread all over the place. Okay. So it has to be contained, or it would take over the entire pond.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, and when I look at how our horticulturists are growing them we have these pop-up ponds for the exhibition. They do have them in pots. So that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure that would help Monet control the amount of water he had for the reflective surface.
Oh, I think he had his gardeners in there every single day, taking off the spent leaves and flowers. Yeah. So it looked perfection.
Yeah.
Like perfection.
What's behind you on your wall? It looks like a water lily painting.
Oh, it's a Monet.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and I don't recognize it as being in any of the ones that I showed. It's surely from the later part of the like 1913 to 1919 or something, not his earliest ones before 1910. But it's a reproduction of a Monet, yes.
I wonder if was that when his eyesight was really
Yeah,
getting that, and so
well,
he blurred, and so everything became more impressionistic looking.
yeah, he was first diagnosed with these cataracts in 1912,
Mm.
did not have them operated on until 1923.
Oh, wow.
And by that time, he had become almost completely blind in one eye.
Hmm.
So yeah, he couldn't see.
That's so interesting. I mean, it also really, when you think about it, you look at the trajectory of his work, how it became more and more impressionistic, more
Yeah.
like evocation, the older he got. It actually makes a lot of sense. Well, John, I think that I don't see any more questions coming in, but this has just been a really pleasant way to spend a lunch hour. So thank you so much for enlightening us and taking the time to share all kinds of wonderful information about water lilies, and Claude Monet's inspiration was really delightful.
All right. Well, it was my pleasure. You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, everybody, take good care, and we'll see you next time. Bye, John.
Bye.